The story starts with a man and a woman wearing kimonos and silently walking by a river. Eventually, they crossed a bridge and kept walking until they reached a specific point in the waterway. At that moment, the man pointed out the river's rapids and said that that river was a real man-eating one. The woman then got closer to him to the point of touching his shoulder with her head and, after calling him sensei, told him it was time for them to go together, to which he agreed. Right after, they both tied their hands together using a red cord, and he declared, after calling her Seiken, that they would be together forever from that moment onwards. However, before they could do or say anything else, a truck appeared and hit them both. Wow, there wasn't even a road there. Truck-kun really takes his work seriously. Anyway, I digress. On that day, a certain great author and his lover left that world. Our protagonist woke up in what seemed to be a church, and he concluded that that was the world people went to after they died. In fact, he even highlighted that it was a Western-styled place. At that moment, a woman who looked like an elf priestess appeared and told him that that was not the world after death. She then welcomed him and introduced herself as the guide of those who descended upon that world. Her name was Annette. She also explained to him that he was in a different world from the one he had come from. They both walked towards a window, and he could see a dragon flying outside while she told him that he had been chosen and transported there, to that land enclosed in darkness which was called Zauberberg. Annette then indicated that his mission was for him to become a hero who brought light to that world. However, his reaction was unusual. Instead of panicking or getting excited, he kept his undaunted demeanor and just wanted to double-check if, after failing to kill his lover and himself, he had been taken to that strange world. After Annette confirmed it, he only said his life had been shameful. The priestess then was about to tell him the details of his mission, but before she could say anything, he took several sedative pills in another attempt to take his life, which panicked the woman. However, the priestess thought fast and used purifying magic to save him. Almost immediately, he woke up, and without losing his composure, he told her that she didn't need to do that. In fact, he added that she was bothering him and asked her to stop. Nevertheless, the woman didn't listen to him. She reprimanded him and reaffirmed that he would become a hero who would fulfill his great mission of saving that world. Unfortunately for her, he replied that he didn't care about that and added that he was just looking for a place to die. He then began to take more pills, which panicked the priestess again. The woman then asked him why he was doing that after being chosen by that world. He laughed at her and told her he hadn't asked to be chosen, but the priestess asked him back if he hadn't been visited by a truck, which he confirmed. She then explained that the truck was the Otherworld Selection Truck. Wow, Truck-kun is canon in this story. Among the many people in our protagonist's old world who lived unhappy lives, only those struck by that truck got to redo their lives in that world. That was the service they provided. By the way, while she tried to sell him how marvelous had been the opportunity given to him, he kept taking sedative pills as if they were candy. Nevertheless, once the priestess finished, he got close to her, grabbed her staff, and told her that the truck had interfered with what was meant to be the happiest moment of his life. He then asked her who they were to decide if someone was unhappy or not. He then began to smoke. As for the priestess, she couldn't believe his attitude. She thought that he had been saved from an unhappy life, yet he was acting that way. Right after, she showed him his stats in an attempt to cheer him up. After all, without exception, every human taken to that world was granted the ability to wield superhuman powers. Sadly, his stats were almost zero. He was so weak that even after being detoxified, he was still showing the poison status. She then began to panic and quickly searched through all his status windows only to confirm he was extremely weak. He then tried to leave, but she grabbed his hand and apologized since it seemed that he had indeed been taken to that world by mistake. In fact, he was not fit to live in that world. However, he simply smiled at her and replied that that had been the story of his life. She then offered him to stay at the church for a while because he was too weak to survive outside. but he rejected her and decided to leave. At that moment, she finally realized he was indeed a different man. Up to that moment, she had closed her heart to the chosen ones because their attitude was awful. In short, they were all douchebags, so she simply flattered them again and again. Nevertheless, that time was different. He had indeed touched her. She then tried to stop him by asking him to at least choose a profession before leaving, and he replied that he already had one, writer. Afterward, she complimented her ears and left. What he didn't know was that with his actions he had confirmed to her that he was the man she had been waiting to arrive. Some time later, he was walking on a prairie while eating his candy when a voice in his head told him that he had gained 5 experience points for discovering the Great Plains of Erston, and of course that annoyed him since he suffered from migraines. Sadly, the system didn't care about it and informed him that he had leveled up, so he was level 2 at that moment. Right after, he heard the scream of a cat woman and found that she had been attacked by a death tree. She then recognized him as an adventurer and asked him for his help. He looked at her and realized that had been meeting people with oddly shaped ears that day. He also thought that dying women were certainly beautiful. He then asked her if he could write a novel based on her. That pissed the woman off and she urged him to save her. He then tried to reach her, but she was being held too high, which led to a very awkward moment. She then asked him if he had a sword or some spells or something. Immediately thereafter, the tree caught him by the neck and he found it funny being asphyxiated, which in turn exasperated the woman. She even called him useless, disgusting bastard. On the other hand, he was enjoying that moment since he was finally dying. Those trees had the suction skill that allowed them to steal life force from their captives. Unfortunately for everybody, except the woman of course, by sucking our protagonist's life force the tree got poisoned and died before it could kill its captives. Our protagonist then lamented having survived, and the system informed him he had inflicted 300 points of damage due to his poison, rising 1 level. He was level 3 at that moment. As for the Catwoman, she couldn't believe how he had killed the tree. She even said he had been just pretending to be weak to trick the monster, to which he replied that he was just a man who had wished for death and yet he had survived. In fact, he had tried 5 times to no avail up to that moment. She then tried to cheer him up by inviting him to her place as a way to thank him for saving her life. However, when she took his hand, he looked at the red cord and finally thought of Sakin. He then wondered if she had also gone to that world. He walked away while ignoring the Catwoman's attempts to tell him her name. He was too busy thinking that he had just found a reason to live in that whimsical other world. He would find Sakin so they could finally die together. Meanwhile, at the church, the priestess was praying to the gods of that world, so they protected that adventurer and allowed them to meet again someday. At that moment, our protagonist opened the door of the church, which made the priestess very happy. Nevertheless, when she was running to hug him, the Catwoman appeared behind him asking why they had gone to that place. The priestess froze after seeing the Catwoman since she didn't know who she was. But before she could say anything, our protagonist, who liked to be called Sensei, told her he had a question for her. Right after, he said he was looking for a woman named Sakin and asked her if she had any idea of where she might be. That question shocked the priestess because it implied the existence of another woman in his life. Sadly, the priestess knew nothing, and he left the church with the Catwoman thinking he didn't have any leads to find Sakin. The Catwoman then tried to cheer him up and told him that since they've still got a way to go to her place, they should stop by the castle town of Roth. She then tried to grab his hand, but the priestess suddenly appeared and hit her with her staff. She then reprimanded the Catwoman for being shameless by holding a man's hand in public. The Catwoman then asked her why she had decided to go with them, before teasing her saying that she was in love with Sensei. That startled the priestess, who tried to justify her actions, saying that as a clergy person, she had a responsibility to protect that weak otherworlder. The Catwoman was surprised by knowing he was from another world, but quickly clarified that he was strong because he had insta killed a death tree to save her. The priestess couldn't believe that he had gotten that close to another woman and panicked. After all, saving someone's life was a big deal. As for the sensei, he had finally found a nice place to take a nap, a coffin that someone had left in a pile of garbage. He then asked the women to wake him up when they arrived at their destination, and the priestess immediately took a rope to pull the coffin there. Meanwhile, in a castle, a pink-haired lady looked at the lake in front of her while keeping a sad expression. The priestess and the Catwoman were making a huge effort to pull the coffin, with our protagonist inside, by using 2 ropes. You could see they were very tired because it was too heavy. In fact, the Catwoman couldn't take any more and yelled at the sensei since he could walk on his own 2 legs. However, there was no response and the Catwoman even suspected he might be dead, but the priestess quickly checked his status window and confirmed he was okay. She then suggested to keep going since they were already near the castle. By the way, due to our protagonist having called the Catwoman Tama, Annette kept doing the same despite knowing it wasn't her name because she wanted to tease her. As for the sensei, he was thinking of Sakin and swore to himself he would find her so they could kill themselves together. Sometime later, they arrived at their destination, the castle town of Roth, and Tama opened the coffin while waking our protagonist up. He quickly left the coffin and after seeing everything around couldn't help but be convinced that he was indeed in another world. Wow, the people of that town are really tough. They saw a person waking up from a coffin in the middle of a crowded street and they barely reacted. Right after, Annette suggested going to the castle and having an audience with the king. Afterward, they met with the king who kindly welcomed them. He introduced himself as Thomas and his daughter, Princess Charlotte, did the same. He then offered them to rest that night in the castle's bedchambers, which was very well received by the women. Although the king agreed to that on one condition, he wanted to hear travelers' stories because he loved them very much. After hearing that, the sensei smiled and asked if he could tell them how it felt to sleep in a coffin. Of course, that startled the king, who even thought our protagonist might be threatening him. Luckily, Annette quickly stepped in and complimented the princess' beauty. That lightened the mood, and the king happily told her that her daughter was going to get married soon. He even asked them for advice regarding that matter. Immediately thereafter, he introduced Gomez, the valiant warrior, and Otto, the wandering minstrel of love, to the travelers. The king then explained that perhaps due to the influence of the wrathful Dark Lord, monster activity had increased in recent times. Nevertheless, he had grown too old to deal with that problem. So he had decided that one of those 2 would become Charlotte's husband and the next king. The problem was that Charlotte hadn't chosen a candidate yet, so he asked the travelers who was the more suitable husband for Charlotte. The sensei then stopped eating his candy and with a solemn demeanor replied that he had no idea, which startled the king. However, our protagonist didn't stop there. He said that Charlotte's future hinged on that critical choice, so the king shouldn't be taking advice on that matter from travelers who had just arrived that day. He also said that the king was horrible and a tyrant. Heck, he even added that Thomas was not fit to be a king. Well, at least he admitted that since he was not fit to live in that world, he had no right to say that. The sensei left after that, and both the priestess and the Catwoman began to apologize to the king for his behavior. They said that since he was an otherworlder, he might be a bit rash. Luckily, the otherworlder thing was enough to appease the king. By the way, while they were talking, the princess couldn't help but stare at our protagonist until he left the throne room. That night, our protagonist was in one of the rooms looking at the moon through a window, when the priestess woke up and asked him if he was having trouble sleeping. They were sleeping in separate beds, in case you wondered. He turned his head to look at her in the eye and replied that he never slept well. Those words hit her hard, and after a pause, she finally asked him who was Sakin. Unfortunately, before he could answer, the priestess noticed that Tama was sleeping under our protagonist's blankets. The Catwoman was even resting her head on his thighs. That was too much for Annette, who hit the other with a pillow and began reprimanding her. Both women kept fighting for a while, and the sensei took advantage of the chaos to leave the room unnoticed. He then began to wander through the corridors of the castle and eventually met Charlotte, who was looking at the lake with the same sad expression as before. He got closer to her and told her it was a nice view. She agreed, and they both began to contemplate the lake and the moon's reflection on its surface. However, he quickly killed the mood by saying that it made him want to drown himself. Obviously, that startled the princess, who asked him if he was so troubled that he wished to kill himself. But he only scoffed at her and replied that it seemed to him that she was more troubled than him. She went silent, but after a while, he said that she still couldn't choose between Mr. Gomez and Otto. On the one hand, Mr. Gomez was already the most dependable of their soldiers, and the king had faith in his strength as well. For that reason, she should probably choose him. On the other hand, Otto was her childhood friend. Whenever she felt down, he wrote songs and went to sing them to her. In the end, she didn't know what to do. He then laughed a little and said that, unlike him, she was a truly kind girl who cared for her father. He also added that his life had been a continuous series of troubles. In fact, he had attempted to kill himself and die with someone else numerous times, which inconvenienced his father and family greatly. However, he made clear that he had never once asked anyone else to choose how he should live for him. In the end, she should decide for herself what she would do, and for that, she should ask herself what she truly wanted. He left after saying that, but those words resonated deeply with the princess. The next day, the king summoned the travelers again to the throne room, where he was along with the princess, Otto, and Mr. Gomez. The reason was that Charlotte had finally chosen who she would marry, so he wanted the travelers to act as witnesses. Annette and Tama placed their bets and argued a little since they were supporting different candidates. And right after the king asked Charlotte to stand before the man she had chosen and spoke her vows. She then went towards our protagonist, took his hand, and declared that she wanted to die together with him. Of course, that astonished everybody. Heck, even the priestess passed out after declaring there was no God. Charlotte then explained that after talking to the sensei, she had realized that she didn't want to marry any of the candidates because they both had things that annoyed her. Obviously, the king couldn't accept that and tried to force her to choose a husband. In fact, he took her decision worse than the candidates themselves. The princess then reprimanded his father because he wanted her to get married without asking her opinion. In the end, nobody had considered her feelings, except for our protagonist. Nevertheless, before they could keep talking, Mr. Gomez removed his armor and revealed himself as a minotaur, a servant of the wrathful Dark Lord. He then confessed he had intended to acquire that kingdom by becoming its king and then offering it to the Dark Lord. The worst part for the Minotaur was that he had blown out his cover due to a misunderstanding. He had thought the princess had seen through his disguise, but she simply didn't like him. Sadly, he couldn't back down at that point, so he decided to kill everybody. Some soldiers arrived after hearing the commotion, but the Minotaur easily defeated them. Right after, Tama stopped trying to wake up the priestess and faced the Minotaur. After all, she was a level 14 martial artist. Otto, as a level 89 wandering minstrel, began to sing a song with his harp, and Tama thought she would receive some buffs. But nothing happened, except for our protagonist being entranced by the melody. The battle continued, but Tama was unable to hurt the Minotaur. On the contrary, he had already wounded her with his horns. He even declared that he would kill her with his next attack. Nevertheless, before he could act, the sensei interrupted him and asked if he could kill him and the princess first. That caught the Minotaur by surprise. Even the princess didn't see that coming, but he calmly explained that both of them wished to die. The Minotaur laughed and replied he would grant them their wish. He also added that afterward, he would burn the city to the ground, killing every last citizen of that kingdom. The sensei then said that there was no problem with that. After all, since they were about to die, nothing mattered to them. Charlotte began to tremble, but our protagonist ignored it, and the Minotaur launched his attack. Right after, as the princess faced death for real, Charlotte realized she didn't want to die, but to live and protect the people of that kingdom. After hearing her words, our protagonist acknowledged her true desire and told her that he knew she was a kind princess. He then pushed her away while saying that she was not fit to share that moment with him. Unfortunately for the sensei, Annette had finally woken up and created a barrier to block the attack while saying that she wouldn't let him die as long as she was by his side. As a level 18 priestess, her barrier was strong enough to break the Minotaur's horns. Immediately thereafter, Tama delivered the finishing blow with a skill attack and sent the Minotaur through the wall directly to the lake. Afterward, both Annette and Tama thanked each other and buried the hatchet. Right after, the king kneeled before her and apologized for what he had done. Charlotte forgave him, and they both cried together out of happiness. Later, Thomas abdicated the throne, and a 16-year-old Charlotte was crowned queen. As for the trio, Tama and Annette resumed their sacred task of pulling the sensei's coffin while he rested in peace inside. Both women were wondering if Charlotte would be okay, but our protagonist quickly said that they had nothing to worry about because it had been a decision she had made for herself. He then opened the coffin, and while looking at the castle in the distance, he said that although dying women were certainly beautiful, those who stood up on their own 2 feet were beautiful too. Sometime later, on a rainy night, an injured Annette arrived at a church, but when a fellow priestess tried to help her, she managed to ask her to help her companion instead. The other priestess then took a look at the man beside her and clenched her teeth after realizing he was badly wounded. Right after, she asked to get every healing potion they had and to summon every priest present. A flashback began showing Tama and Annette performing the sacred task of pulling the sensei's coffin, with him inside. Then, they decided to take a break to eat something. Right after, the ultra-mega Chad of this story, well, he didn't show up, and I don't think there is one in the first place. As for our protagonist, he opened the coffin and the priestess offered him some bread. However, he asked her if they had boiled tofu and immediately thereafter closed the coffin. Annette didn't mind being rejected and instead noted the request while saying they would look for some in the next town. Of course, her reaction left Tama completely flabbergasted, and the Catwoman had to admit that the other had an indomitable spirit. Tama then asked Annette if they were close to Grun, the hometown of the Catwoman, and the priestess told her that they should be arriving within a few days. However, she asked her to allow them to make a stop at Zweitan Temple. Tama said she didn't mind, but she yet asked why the other had requested that. Annette then explained that normally, otherworlders arrived at one of 4 temples in their world and departed for the Dark Lord's castle from there. Nevertheless, the goal of our protagonist was not to defeat the Dark Lord, but to find Saken instead, so they should visit the 4 temples to gather information. Of course, that meant that in the worst-case scenario, they might end up having to travel all around the world. Is this foreshadowing? Because I don't think they will find Saken anytime soon. By the way, Annette didn't have any issues if they ended up doing that, but for Tama was another story. The Catwoman even said the priestess was crazy. Well, I wouldn't say she's crazy, but I have to admit she is simping hard. After hearing Tama's remark, Annette replied that she didn't want Sensei to fight the Dark Lord since she didn't want him to put himself in danger. Of course, she was aware that her attitude made her look like a dreadful guide for otherworlders. However, the Catwoman knew better. She was completely sure at that point that the priestess should really love Sensei, and after seeing how vehemently the other denied that once she heard it, only confirmed it. As a form of explanation, the priestess said that Sensei had shown her the light when she had given up hope for her job, so she felt the obligation to help him. Tama immediately asked her what would happen if Saken was his lover, and the bullet hit the mark because the other almost passed out. although she managed to say that she had decided to go with him to verify that. After hearing those words, Tama informed her that she would also go with them, but only until they reached her hometown, which Annette didn't take well. Nevertheless, there was a bigger issue with Annette's plans. Tama wasn't sure that the priestess would be allowed into the temple. After all, she had ditched her previous job to go with them. However, Annette told her that it was okay since the head priest of Zweiten Temple was a dear friend of hers. Moreover, she hadn't left her post without notice. She had sent her familiar to deliver her resignation. Right after, a bat-like creature appeared and began to bite our protagonist's head. He had left the coffin to smoke a cigarette, making him bleed, which startled the priestess. She quickly reprimanded her familiar for always causing mischief, while Tama took care of Sensei's wound. But the worst was yet to come. When Annette asked her familiar if it had delivered her resignation, its response was throwing up the letter in front of her. Of course, that pissed her off, and she hit the creature while asking why it had come back without fulfilling the task. Nevertheless, Sensei found the whole thing amusing, and he even praised the creature for having returned with its master, before giving it a name, Milos, which made him earn the familiar's favor. In the end, our protagonist returned to his coffin, while Annette was overwhelmed by despair because officially, she had left her post without notice. Right after, a giant dragon landed in front of them, terrifying the entire group, familiar included. Annette couldn't understand why the world's most powerful monster had appeared there. Luckily, before it could attack, a young lady, whose face was covered by a hood, told the dragon, whose name was Ruka, to stop. She then got closer to the monster and began caressing its head while talking in a different language. Shortly after, the dragon began to show signs of being pacified, which astonished both women. Annette then asked who she was, but she only replied that there were many monsters in that area and advised them to leave quickly. She then noticed the coffin and thought the group had already suffered casualties, but our protagonist quickly opened it thinking it was time to eat. Annette then tried to explain that he was an eccentric otherworlder, but those words triggered something within the lady because almost immediately she took out her robe, revealing to be a dragon woman. The next thing they saw was the young lady saying she would kill all otherworlders. A fight began, but the young lady very soon proved to be insanely powerful, to the point of making both women unable to move. However, what really surprised the priestess was a mark that appeared in her chest during the battle, because that mark identified the young lady as the wrathful Dark Lord. Immediately thereafter, our protagonist, who wasn't being restrained, walked towards the Dark Lord and told her that he was the only otherworlder there. So if she wanted to kill somebody, it should be him, not his companions. Wow, I have to admit this guy has guts. Yes, I know he did that because he wanted her to kill him. But even though, walking towards a person that powerful and taunting her requires a strong will. Obviously, the Dark Lord wasn't playing, and she immediately pierced his chest with her arm, which shocked Annette and Tama. Afterward, she removed her arm from his body, and he fell on the floor bleeding himself while she walked away saying her name was Waldelia. Nevertheless, against everybody's expectations, mine included, he stood up and told her that he could tell she possessed a powerful hatred. After all, he had once stabbed someone too. Of course, that put her on guard because she didn't understand what was happening. He then walked towards her while saying that at that time he had lost his mind to intense hatred. Right after, he caressed her left cheek with his hand and asked her if that was what was happening to her at that moment. After all, her eyes looked sad. Waldelia was so flabbergasted that her only reaction was to call her dragon and flee while wondering who was our protagonist. By the way, at that moment Sensei had already lost consciousness. Back to the present, Milos had transformed into a magic carpet and had taken them to the temple where the priestess in charge had asked to get every healing potion they had and to summon every priest present. The next day, our protagonist was wandering through the city with Tama. After a while, they found a store and Sensei bought a bottle of poison. But when the seller was telling him how to use it against monsters, our protagonist drank its contents, leaving the seller and the Catwoman astonished. Okay, I have to admit, this protagonist knows what he wants and doesn't hesitate in trying to achieve it. In front of the store, Annette and her friend, Usha, were drinking some beverages while watching the show. Annette then thanked the other and asked her if she knew an otherworlder named Sakin. Sadly, the other didn't recognize that name. Usha then began reprimanding her friend for having left her post without notice and for traveling with an otherworlder because all of them were indecent people. Annette then began to defend Sensei, and she told her friend that if not for him, she wouldn't be who she was at that moment. Of course, it didn't help her case that she quickly lent him money when he told her he wanted to buy something. Come on, at least ask what he wants to buy, especially since you know he is willing to go to any extent to die. However, Usha was surprised when she learned that our protagonist hadn't received any special power. Especially when Annette told her that he had risked his life against the Dark Lord to protect her and Tama. I would bet that sacrifice would lose its brightness if she also added that his goal is to die. Now, the part that truly surprised Usha was hearing the wrathful Dark Lord had attacked them since he had been destroyed by another otherworlder 7 days before. Somewhere else, in a dark castle, a dragon was being restrained by an otherworlder who mocked him, saying they had already dealt with its master. What that otherworlder didn't know was that Waldelia, who happened to be the daughter of the previous Dark Lord, and her dragon were outside with a strong desire for revenge. Back with the trio, Tama and Annette were discussing the news of the Dark Lord being defeated and wondered who might be the young lady they had battled before. Not to mention, our protagonist had been brought to that world 7 days before, which made no sense if the Dark Lord had already been destroyed. As for Sensei, he was feeling despair because he wanted to write about the things he had experienced since arriving in that world, but was struggling to write, even though he didn't mind crushing Annette's heart by saying he hadn't written anything about her. This guy is diabolic in a very twisted way. The priestess then took them to buy some things, and almost immediately she bought our protagonist a huge and heavy armor. My goodness, that thing looked capable of withstanding the impact of a missile. The armor was so heavy he couldn't even walk, so Tama and Annette left him in the street while they went shopping. Shortly after, Usha found him and informed him that from that moment onwards, Annette would be staying with her because she was very pure, and being with an otherworlder would definitely make her unhappy. She even demanded him to dissolve his party with her. However, he replied that it was for Annette to decide if she wanted to go with him or not, since she was not a bird in a cage. Usha didn't back down and made clear that she didn't trust otherworlders, and as if to confirm her words, at that moment, 2 otherworlders appeared and began to cause problems by announcing the beginning of a new age ruled by the otherworlders. To make things worse, one of them recognized Annette, who had previously punched him. Well, it had been Usha, but Sensei's friend had been with her, and the other one immediately and menacingly walked toward her. Sometime later, the entire town was burning while our protagonist smiled, saying he felt he could finally write his masterpiece. One of the otherworlders, a blonde guy, stood before Annette and patted her head in a friendly manner. What nobody of the people there knew was that he took that chance to cast an enslaving spell on the priestess, forcing her to become his pet. Hentai detected? The blonde woman immediately fell on her knees, and the second otherworlder, the rapper who had accused her of punching him, mocked her, saying that the purer they were, the sooner they fell to the blonde guy's skill. Apparently, being pure had backfired to the elf. However, right after, Tama grabbed the rapper by the collar and asked him what they had done to her friend. Still, the otherworlder laughed at her and replied it was already too late, since Suzuki's skill unconditionally turned anyone he petted into his slave. Unfortunately for her, Suzuki patted her from behind and she also fell on her knees. Shame on her as a warrior. The blonde guy then began laughing while saying that no human or monster could resist his overpowered skill pet. At that moment, Usha appeared and told him that it had been enough. She also added that she didn't recall teaching him to use his gift that way and that the town of Vale would never surrender to him. After hearing those words, Suzuki simply scoffed and replied that he would completely destroy their town and build a new kingdom. Afterward, he sent all his pets, a pack of wolves, to attack the people. Usha tried to stop him, but 4 wolves surrounded her, and Suzuki told her that he was going to use her church as his castle. Some time later, the town was in chaos. The wolves kept attacking the people and the buildings with fireballs they cast from their mouths. There was debris everywhere, and the people ran trying to escape from the danger. Meanwhile, Tama was attacking Sensei's armor like a mad beast, but luckily for our protagonist, she couldn't inflict any damage. As for him, he was kind of amused by the situation and thought that Annette had been right since there was no telling when or by whom they would be attacked. I'd bet she didn't consider being enslaved along with Tama. Tama kept hitting the armor until she managed to break it, but one of the fragments hit her back in her head and knocked her out. Sensei took that opportunity to leave the armor, take the Catwoman, and put her inside a barrel. He then covered it and put a warning on it so other people wouldn't open it. Immediately thereafter, Usha was thrown against a wall and she couldn't help but curse at the situation. He then greeted her and she took the chance to admonish him, saying that was what otherworlders were really like. Damn, little lady. The priestess kept complaining since Suzuki not only used his gift for his selfish desires, but his greed had become completely unstoppable and he had lost control. Nevertheless, our protagonist's reaction flabbergasted her, since he began taking notes while saying the blonde guy was the kind of man who excited his sensitivities. Afterward, he asked for his whereabouts, asked Usha to take care of Tama, and went to meet him, despite her warnings, because he had a feeling he would finally be able to write his masterpiece. However, at the last moment, the priestess decided to go with him. Shortly after, they arrived at the church and he quickly opened the main doors, which gave her a huge headache since she believed he wouldn't stand a chance against Suzuki and his minion. She couldn't believe he was that stupid and said that was why she hated otherworlders. I wouldn't say that while being part of an Isekai'd anime, you know? Once inside, Sensei told Suzuki he wanted to write a novel based on him, which caught his and the rapper's attention. The blonde guy even guessed our protagonist wished to write the heroic tale of Suzuki, the hero conquering another world. Sadly, Sensei burst his bubble and said that he wanted to write a story about a man who gained more power than he deserved and fell to his own greed. Obviously, the blonde guy didn't like his words and ordered his pets to attack him. Nobody tolerates an honest critic these days. Usha tried to stop the wolves, but she was quickly overwhelmed by them. Right after, Suzuki ordered his 3 last pets to cast some fireballs against our protagonist, who simply stood there writing. Nevertheless, at the last moment, Milos appeared wearing the armor's helmet and parried the spells, returning them back to the blonde and his minion. Wait, is this I parry everything? Let me double check. No, false alarm. Suzuki and the rapper managed to withstand the blow, and the blonde guy ordered his strongest wolf to attack Sensei. The pet bit our protagonist, and the otherworlders thought they had won, but almost immediately the wolf died due to the insanely high concentration of poison in our protagonist's blood. The rapper was astonished, and the blonde guy was very pissed after seeing how things had turned out. On the other hand, Usha quickly concluded that our protagonist had infused his own body with poison. Well, he just wanted to die, so I wouldn't give him much credit for a convenient side effect. The minion then decided to flee and Usha asked Suzuki to surrender, but the blonde guy decided to use his trump card, Annette. He commanded his pet to kill the other priestess, who immediately tried to awaken her from the enslaving spell by the power of friendship. I think this is a job for Naruto, not an elf priestess. Usha didn't want to fight her friend, so he told our protagonist they should escape, but Sensei had other plans. He walked towards Annette, saying that Annette was stronger than Usha thought, and when Suzuki told him she would never be able to break free from his spell, our protagonist simply replied that was not for him to decide. Afterward, he stood in front of her and told her he knew she wasn't a bird in a cage. Those words affected Annette, who cut herself with the dagger she was holding, trying to stop herself from killing Sensei. Suzuki went mad after seeing that and tried to force her to kill our protagonist by increasing the power of his spell, but he stabbed herself in her leg instead, breaking free from the spell. Naruto would be proud of Sensei. That surprised both Usha and Suzuki. The former was then asked by Sensei to treat her friend's wounds, and the latter fell on his knees, unable to believe his overpowered skill had been defeated. Right after, the blonde guy took the dagger to kill himself, but Sensei stopped him since he was writing a book about him, so he couldn't die yet. In fact, he then asked the other to tell him his story. As for Usha, she began reflecting on the words Sensei had told her before, about Annette being stronger than she thought. A flashback then began showing Suzuki being bullied in his previous world. He then recalled that he had become the pet of his bullies. He had thought about dying countless times, but didn't manage to do something about it until one day Truck-kun sent him to that fantasy world. Usha welcomed him with open arms and explained his mission to him. He then began training to use his gift, but the people from that new world were mean to him, which triggered his trauma and made him use his gift against them. In the end, after all the hardships he had gone through, it was naive to expect he would really commit to the mission of saving an alien world. Yeah, the hero recruiting process of that world is a mess, to say the least. Back to the present, he told Sensei that he couldn't even commit evil properly. After all, no matter what world he inhabited, he was just a weak-willed nobody. Immediately thereafter, our protagonist announced he had finished his novel, and added he had written a story of a miserable man who, despite hoping to live as a hero in that world, could become neither a hero nor a villain due to his own weakness. Wow, that was both harsh and accurate. Afterward, Sensei named his new novel No Longer Allowed in Another World. Right after, all the pages Sensei had written began floating around Suzuki, creating a magic circle. Unaware of his own spell, our protagonist said he didn't think the story he had just written was a masterpiece and tore apart one of the pages, which activated the magic circle, sending Suzuki back to his own world. That astonished both priestesses, who couldn't believe what had just happened. At that moment, Annette noticed that in Sensei's status window, a gift had appeared, and it was called writing. After seeing that, Usha concluded that was probably a special skill that only activated against certain targets, otherworlders, which would mean our protagonist had been taken there to fight otherworlders. Unfortunately, Sensei was again depressed, wondering if he would ever find anyone else to excite his sensitivities. It was then that he realized Suzuki was gone, and when he asked what had happened to him, Annette explained that he had sent him back to his world. Back in the town, Suzuki's pets were released from his spell and decided to leave, while Tama got out of the barrel, complaining about being there in the first place. Some time later, Usha gave Sensei the coffin he had requested, and while he was enjoying it, she took Annette away to talk with her. She then told her friend that Sensei might have an important role to fulfill in the future of that world, which meant that their journey would be difficult and dangerous. Indeed, the hero recruiting process of that world is dreadful. How can they choose a man who wants to kill himself to be their chosen one? Annette wanted to say something, but Usha cut her off and added that she should support him. Afterward, the trio along with Milos decided it was time to leave that town. But before they left, Usha asked our protagonist if Suzuki had turned out that way because that world had granted him more power than he deserved. She also asked him if the blonde guy would live a miserable life again after returning to his own world. To the first question, he simply replied no one knew, and for the second one, he told her that it was true that the story of Suzuki, the hero in that world, had ended, but his story in his own world had not. So it was up to him whether it became a masterpiece or not. Those words surprised Usha, but also gave them comfort. Speaking of Suzuki, after returning to his own world, he had managed to find a job in a konbini that happened to have a kind manager, and he decided to give it a try to his own life. Good luck, man. In the Sontag region, at the Weib Cathedral of the Papal State, Asha arrived via teleportation and a priest called Wolf welcomed her. However, the woman quickly scolded him for drinking again, but the other replied that he simply couldn't quit it. In fact, he said she was lucky Demis lived in her jurisdiction. On the other hand, he was living in a nightmare because he had to deal with dwarves every day, and their body odor was horrendous. At that moment, another priest, who was called Sir Goblin, arrived and scolded Wolf for making such speciesist remarks in the Papal State. Bishop Wolf quickly apologized and replied that not only the other was the first non-elf to be appointed a priest, but he also had achieved the rank of archbishop. Sir Goblin replied that a person's species was irrelevant. In fact, there were plenty of elves who acted in a manner unbecoming of elves. Those words pissed Wolf, and he immediately ranted at the other, asking if he wanted to swap jurisdiction with him, and saying the other was lucky because his jurisdiction was always very peaceful. Complaining about his job? However, Sir Goblin remained calm and replied that it was the boon of the people's faith and the Queen's favor. He even added that perhaps Wolf should try mending his ways, but before the other could reply, Cardinal Miller arrived and told the other to take their seats. Once they were all seated, the cardinal apologized for having summoned them when they were all very busy. However, before he could say anything else, a priestess arrived in a hurry and ended up tripping and falling. The newcomer, a red-haired elf lady, quickly apologized and the cardinal introduced her as the new bishop of Erston Temple. He then asked them to introduce themselves and make their reports. The new priestess was the first one, and she introduced herself as Bishop Aria, the replacement of Bishop Annette. At least she's energetic, which is way better than Wolf's attitude. Right after, she began her report saying Dean Stark, the Holy Land of Mountains and Flames, had nothing to report. The cardinal then said that he had heard Charlotte, the daughter of the King of Roth, had inherited the throne, and the other was shocked due to her omission. Luckily, Elton, also known as Sir Goblin, stopped her from embarrassing herself anymore and introduced himself as the Archbishop of the Virton Temple. He then reported that peace and calm continued to prevail in his jurisdiction of the Mitwalk region, the Holy Land of Lakes and Water. However, when Aria thought the worst had passed, Elton reminded her that tardiness was strictly prohibited. Right after, it was Wolf's turn, and he introduced himself as the Bishop of the Dritten Temple. Regarding his report, his jurisdiction of Samstag, the Holy Land of Deserts and Earth, was way out in the sticks, but they were managing all right. The cardinal then said that he had heard there were frequent conflicts between the dwarves. I wonder from who he had heard that. And Wolf replied that it was an everyday occurrence and added that they even hit him when he tried to mediate. Finally, Asha introduced herself as the Bishop of the Zweiden Temple. As for her report, she said that several days before in her jurisdiction of Donnerstag, the Holy Land of Forest and Wind, an otherworlder had gone on a rampage and had destroyed half the town of Vale. They were currently working to restore the place. Her ability to summarize is amazing. She should be the one writing this recap. After hearing that, the cardinal sighed and told them that he had summoned them that day to discuss the otherworlders. The wrathful Dark Lord had been defeated by a group of otherworlders, and because of that, the Pope had decided to seal the magic circles connecting their world to others and cease summoning otherworlders. Elton was the first to react and said he was glad the battle against the detestable Dark Lord had ended. Right after, Wolf said that they were finally free from looking after those addled otherworlders. Afterward, the cardinal told them that the 7 otherworlders who had defeated the wrathful Dark Lord had claimed the Dark Lord's lands and had become its new rulers. That news shocked the bishops, but the cardinal hadn't finished yet. He then said that the Pope had just received a declaration from those 7. With their might, they were planning to transform all the lands of Zauberberg into a utopia. Of course, the bishops didn't like that at all, and Asha quickly asked what had said the Pope. The cardinal quickly replied that the Pope was greatly distressed. After all, he believed the otherworlders were angels sent to save their world and freely had given his love to them. Nevertheless, those people he had considered his own children had bared their fangs against him. Either way, they should consider that a declaration of war against the world's Church of Helsihen. In short, the 7 archangels who had saved the world had become 7 fallen angels threatening it. Well, here we have the plot of King's Raid, the mobile game, but with less drama and no romance. At the same time, they shouldn't ignore the fallen otherworlders who had begun causing chaos in each region. On top of that, Waldelia, the daughter of the wrathful Dark Lord who disappeared from his castle, couldn't be overlooked either. In short, Zauberberg had entered a new era. The bishops became worried after hearing that because they didn't know how to fight the otherworlders. It was at that moment that Usher recalled what had happened with Suzuki and said that perhaps there was a way to deal with them. Right after, she explained how Sensei had sent Suzuki back to his own world. Of course, that shocked everybody, but before they could discuss the matter further, the Pope himself appeared and said that that angel might be their ray of hope. He then asked Asha if she could tell him more about him. Our boy is becoming famous. Meanwhile, at the Dark Lord's castle, a man and a woman were talking about how she missed her beloved and how their allies had departed for various lands. The man then raised his cup and said they would remain there and observe what was in store for that world. Back with our protagonist, they had arrived in a town and decided to spend the night there before entering Grun. However, at that moment the system informed Tama she had leveled up, reaching level 17. Although he had mixed feelings about leveling up by dragging a coffin. They were looking for an inn when a young boy told them where they could find one. He then asked them if they were travelers and if they were interested in some information that would help them in their adventures. If that kid didn't appear in the opening, I'd say he's a scammer. He then told them about the Otherworlder Dispatch Service, also known as Hero Introduction Service. In short, some Otherworlders offered their services to accompany parties that lacked confidence in their skills, providing them with a safe and comfortable journey. He also told them that he had come out with that idea and right after began to convince them to hire an Otherworlder. Tama wasn't that impressed, especially after what had happened before, but Annette was ready to give the kid her money for Sensei's safety. Of course, the boy then saw his opportunity and tried to appeal to them using the dead man as a motivation. Yup, this kid is a scammer. Appearing in the opening is not enough for his defense at this point. In the end, Sensei scared the hell out of him when he came out of the coffin. But still, the kid managed to take Annette's money under the promise of hiring a warrior for their journey. That night they were still waiting for Nur, the boy, but he didn't appear. Sensei then said he wouldn't come since he had the eyes of a scammer, which was confirmed by the innkeeper who said that the boy had fooled them. After hearing that, Annette almost passed out because she had paid 40,000, but she managed to keep her manners. Right after, Sensei asked the innkeeper what she knew about the boy. The innkeeper then said he was an orphan who had made a living fooling visitors who arrived at that town. He was the town nuisance, and she even felt sorry for him. In the meantime, the boy was near the river looking at a sword he had in his hands when he was suddenly kidnapped. A while later, Nur woke up in a cabin in the middle of the forest and discovered he had been tied up by 3 people who had taken everything from him. He tried to fool them saying his Otherworlders' friends would help him, but the others mocked him because they were Otherworlders. Nur was astonished and couldn't believe the so-called heroes were acting that way, especially when the trio decided to kill him. Luckily, when their leader was about to shoot him with a crossbow, Sensei appeared and moved his arm, making the arrow hit the leg of one of the minions. Right after, the other one analyzed him and freaked out after confirming he was an Otherworlder, but almost immediately told their leader they could attack him since his stats were trash. The leader then aimed his crossbow at Sensei, who got very excited about the possibility of being killed. In fact, his stats began to rise so fast that the Otherworlders didn't know what to do. To make things more complicated, Sensei began to walk towards them looking very creepy, while showing where the leader should aim his arrow to secure the kill. In the end, the trio couldn't handle their emotions and ran away screaming that our protagonist was a pervert, and that's why it is important to be able to work under pressure. In the end, Sensei was disappointed, saying the others were liars, but before he could think of anything else, Nur asked him if he was a hero, which our protagonist quickly denied. However, the kid truly saw him as a hero and was very happy. After seeing Nur's expression, Sensei smiled and said adults were youths who had been betrayed, but he was still a child, as he should be. He was not ready to become an adult yet. Afterward, he left, and yes, he didn't untie the kid. 10 points to Gryffindor. The next morning, our protagonists were ready to resume their journey, although Annette was being pretty intense trying to know why Sensei looked sleepy. Especially after he said he had spent a delightful night. Come on, just enter the coffin with him already. At that moment, Nur appeared and told them he was ready to go with them. Tama got pissed after seeing him and demanded he return their money. But he said he hadn't lied because he was the warrior who would accompany them. He even had his sword tied to his back. Wow, this kid has potential. Some time later, they arrived at their destination, Tama's homeland, the city of Grün, and the Catwoman finally made Nur drag the coffin in her place. Of course, the young boy freaked out after learning Sensei wanted to die and how the ladies downplayed that. Just your regular heroic journey. Annette noticed there was a checkpoint at the castle's entrance, but Tama said it was okay since she was famous there. Sadly, once the guards saw her, they immediately arrested our protagonist. Well, she was famous indeed. Inside a prison cell, Annette was crying out loud while Nur said that Tama had been taken somewhere else and wondered if they had been arrested because of her. After all, they had arrested her and everyone she was with the moment they saw her. Nur then commented that considering the reaction of the people, Tama should have committed a terrible crime there. Perhaps she had stolen from royalty. At that moment, Annette cut him off and said that Tama wasn't a thieving cat. Right after, Sensei woke up and asked the priestess how they executed people in that world. However, she refused to answer the question because Sensei's expression was selling his intentions of somehow getting himself executed. Afterward, Nur said that they should try to escape even if it was without her, but Annette had no idea of how to escape from that cell. Luckily, Nur was not only a scammer but also a thief, so he quickly opened the cell's lock. And no, Annette, that's not the skill of a valiant warrior, you're right, but it's still a very useful skill for times like those. Unfortunately, Sensei was also not happy with Nur's action since he wanted to be executed. But luckily for our protagonist, the guards arrived and caught them red-handed, so they tied them up with some ropes. At that moment, Sensei asked one of the guards if they were going to be executed, but his expression was so creepy that the guard failed to reply. Afterward, they were taken to the throne room where the Minister Briard of the Kingdom of Grün informed them that the crimes they had committed were quite severe, and therefore they would be executed. Annette asked what crimes they had allegedly committed, and King Siberian, who was also there, replied that they had kidnapped their kingdom's princess, Matilda, so execution was the appropriate punishment. Let me make a wild guess here. Tama is Princess Matilda, right? The priestess began to protest, but she was interrupted by Tama, who had just arrived and looked completely different since she was wearing a royal dress. The Catwoman was pissed and reprimanded her father, saying that she hadn't been kidnapped. Tama then explained that she had been just visiting various nations to improve his martial skills. Of course, both Annette and Nur were flabbergasted after seeing her companion and discovering her true identity. However, Sensei looked deflated. It seemed the execution he was dreaming of would be put on hold indefinitely. The princess then asked her father to release her friends immediately, but he refused at first, which pissed the Catwoman. Right after, the king said that if her daughter did as he said, he would release them. Tama had to swear she would never do anything like that again and would act in a manner befitting a child of royalty, like her mother La Palma. The Catwoman hesitated a little, but after seeing her friends, she decided to comply. She then swore she would act in a manner befitting a princess from that moment onwards. Right after, she apologized to her friends and told them that their journey together had ended. And before they could say anything, she thanked them and left the throne room. Afterward, the minister told them that they were free to go. That night, Nur was happy, saying that there was nothing like a free meal, and asked a waitress if they could get more meat. On the other hand, Annette, who looked dejected, told the kid not to behave crudely. The priestess also reminded Sensei not to be very despondent just because they hadn't been executed. As for our protagonist, he was gorging several of his pills, trying to compensate for the fact of not being executed. By the way, how he keeps getting more and more pills. Do those pills duplicate themselves? Nur then said he was surprised since he had no idea Tama was the princess of that nation, and Annette thought that she had been unbelievably rude to her countless times, so it wouldn't surprise her if she was executed. At that moment, a waitress arrived and asked them if they knew Princess Matilda because she had overheard them saying her name. She then introduced herself as Fawn and said that she used to serve the princess in the palace as her lady-in-waiting. She also asked them if they were her friends, to which Nur replied that up to the day before they were traveling together, but the king had dragged her back to the castle. In the end, that couldn't be helped since she was the princess. The waitress' expression changed, showing disappointment after hearing that. Right after, Sensei told the waitress that he would like to place an order. He also added that she seemed to know what had happened between the two of them, and asked her if she could tell them about it. Then, after a brief exchange, the waitress agreed to tell them the story. Meanwhile, Tama was in the castle laughing while recalling Annette's and Nur's reactions after realizing she was a princess. Right after, she remembered that our protagonist had remained calm as usual and wondered what they were doing at that moment. Immediately thereafter, she saw a silhouette on one of the roofs, and right after somebody attacked the castle, which made the king call his forces. When they arrived at the throne room, they found a mysterious guy sitting disrespectfully on the throne while saying that he hadn't eaten a demi-woman yet and that he wanted to know what their flesh tasted like. He then introduced himself as Kaibara, one of the heroes who had killed the Dark Lord and saved the world. However, at that moment he was known as the Fallen Angel of Gluttony and added that he had gone there to consume the entire nation. Right after, various soldiers attacked him, but he ate them using some kind of huge familiar he could summon at will. He then complained, saying their flesh was hardly edible. In the end, he only wanted to eat women. After witnessing the guy's strength, the king decided to fight him and a battle between the two began. The king managed to withstand the hero's attacks, but unfortunately, his strength was not enough to damage him since Kaibara had eaten several golems, which had increased the toughness of his body. Afterward, Siberian decided to use his ultimate technique because the hero didn't deserve any mercy. Nevertheless, Kaibara didn't look intimidated at all and decided to take that technique head-on. However, when they were about to clash, Tama arrived and she immediately caught the hero's attention. She wanted to join her father in the fight, but the king stopped her, saying she wouldn't be able to replace Leon. In the meantime, the waitress told the trio that Tama had a twin brother called Leon who was the crown prince. They were known as the valiant Prince Leon and the kind Princess Matilda, and everyone in the nation had put their hopes in them. However, one night, during a cave-in on their way back to the castle, Prince Leon and Queen La Palma passed away. Then, after seeing his father very depressed, she told Fawn that she would take Leon's place and put her father's mind at ease. Unfortunately, her decision caused a deep rift between her and her father. Back in the throne room, Tama and her father were arguing, and she decided to recklessly attack the hero, who quickly summoned his familiar to eat her. It was too late when she realized she had made a big mistake, but when she was about to be eaten, her father sacrificed one of his arms to save her. The hero mocked the king for doing that, and Tama got very mad, to the point of trying to attack the hero again. But that time, Briard knocked her out and took her away. Some time later, the trio bid farewell to Fawn, and Nur asked Sensei what he had been writing, but before he could reply, the minister landed in front of them. Right after, the old man began to explain to them the situation, but a huge explosion interrupted him. At that moment, Kaibara appeared before everybody while holding the king as hostage. He then introduced himself as the new king and told the people that he only wanted to taste the flesh of all the varieties of demi-humans who lived there. But he also made clear he only wanted to eat women and children. This guy could be the villain of a Disney movie, a classic one, of course. Obviously, the people tried to resist, but after he ate one of them, the rest began to run away. Unfortunately, he informed them that he had stationed monsters who used to serve the Dark Lord all over town. Afterward, he invited them to his dinner table and went inside the castle. At that moment, Sensei said that after being confined by her father, Tama was the princess of a fallen nation at that moment, the classic heroine of a tragedy. However, he also added that the heroine he sought would never meekly accept tragedy, so he encouraged her to open her eyes and show him the rest of her story. Meanwhile, Tama was having a dream of her mother, where she was telling something important to her. Shortly after, she finally woke up at Fawn's house, and right after she met with her, the minister, and the trio. Afterward, the old man explained to her what had happened, and her immediate reaction was to fight the hero. But the minister, Fawn, and Annette stopped her because even the king had been defeated, which reminded her that he had lost because of her. Arrogance without strength is stupidity. Tama insisted on going, and Annette suddenly said that Fawn's story had reminded her of the terrible accident that had taken the lives of 2 members of the royal family 10 years before. She had heard there hadn't been a single citizen who hadn't shed a tear when they heard the news, which was proof that royalty was beloved by the people in that nation. That was why, if they lost Matilda at that moment, the people would lose hope. So she asked the princess to let them handle the situation. Tama was not sure about it, but the priestess reassured her, saying they had a secret for defeating otherworlders. Right after, the trio went to face the hero, and once they were gone, the minister reminded the princess that she had good friends. 2 ogres blocked the trio's pass at the entrance, but Sensei quickly told them that they had gone there to be eaten because the hero's speech had really touched them. Of course, that left the ogres and his companion flabbergasted. In the end, they decided to arrest them while they conveyed our protagonist's request to the hero, and Annette began to cry out loud for being imprisoned. Deja vu. However, Sensei was not planning to die at that moment, and gave Nur his lockpick, Deja Vu X2. In the meantime, at Fawn's house, the minister went to Tama's room to give her some soup, only to discover she had escaped through the window. Shortly after, the 2 ogres were informing the hero about our protagonist's request, when Tama knocked them out to Kaibara's delight because his most desired dish had arrived. Watch this next video on screen and subscribe to not miss next part.